The secret Nazi plan to win the Cold War. The day the Cold War began. The smell of burnt metal still hung in the air when the first American patrol stumbled into the underground complex. Concrete dust coated everything, broken lights, half-melted filing cabinets, and rows of machines that looked decades too advanced for 1945. Under the faint hum of backup generators, a Soviet unit arrived through another tunnel entrance. For a moment, both sides froze, two futures staring at each other in the dark. Then flashlights cut through the dust, sweeping across tables littered with German-marked blueprints, rockets taller than buildings, engines without propellers, and weapons that didn't belong to 1945 at all. The air itself felt wrong, heavy with the sense that something forbidden had just been uncovered. Outside, Germany was a ruin. Cities were ash and rubble. Inside this hidden laboratory, the future of warfare was sitting on drafting tables. This wasn't some desperate last stand. It looked like preparation for something else. Plans carefully preserved, engines stored like seeds for a future harvest. The war wasn't truly over, it was mutating. And in that forgotten bunker, the first silent confrontation of the Cold War had already begun. As the months ahead would show, this moment wasn't a coincidence. Both armies had orders that reached far beyond victory and surrender. The Americans called it technical intelligence collection. The Soviets called it scientific reparations, labels to soothe conscience. But everyone on both sides knew what it truly was, a hunt for control of the coming world. Because whoever seized Germany's secret technology wouldn't just win prestige, they'd decide who ruled the next century. The mystery was simple but terrifying. Had Hitler's scientists been building machines for a war after this one? Because scattered through the German countryside were bunkers like this, each filled with fragments of terrifying possibility. Jet fighters unlike anything in the skies, missiles that could cross continents, even research hinting at atomic potential years before anyone thought it possible. Washington and Moscow didn't need peace treaties, they needed engineers. The end of World War II became the beginning of a hidden arms race, one fought with blueprints, patents, and the minds of men who'd been building weapons for the Reich just weeks earlier. The confrontation unfolding underground mirrored the world above. Two future superpowers eyeing a new battlefield neither had planned for. Rumors spread like static through radio chatter, whispers of flying discs, supersonic jets, and invisible bombs. To soldiers, it sounded like post-war paranoia. To intelligence officers, it sounded uncomfortably plausible. They knew those whispers were often the first sign that something big was being buried in plain sight. From Vienna to Peenemünde, they catalogued crates of documents, strange allies, untested fuels, complex engines. None of this was fantasy. It was advanced engineering, waiting for someone bold enough to understand it. In Washington, reports lined desks at the Pentagon. High-velocity propulsion recovered, unidentified aeronautic device, liquid-fueled rocket, range beyond 200 miles. In Moscow, commanders filed similar notes, each stamped secret. Behind the triumphal parades and victory announcements, both nations quietly began recruiting the very scientists responsible for these machines. The same men who had once designed weapons to destroy them were now being courted with promises of safety and secrecy. So was Nazi Germany planning for a war it never intended to fight, using technology meant to outlive the Reich? Or had its scientists, seeing defeat inevitable, already decided to offer their knowledge to whichever empire would rise next? Whatever the truth, one fact stood unshakable. The future was being carved out of German ruins. The first battle of the Cold War wasn't fought with tanks or rifles. It was fought over laboratories, notebooks, and the people who wrote them. To see how this Cold War truly began, to understand how a fallen empire's science became the blueprint for a new global standoff, we have to go back to Germany in 1944, when the war was already lost, but the next one was secretly taking shape. The Visionaries of a future war. Germany, 1944. Allied bombers roared overhead, factories stood half ruined, and yet deep inside hidden workshops, a quiet madness persisted, men sketching machines that no one else on Earth could yet imagine. While tanks burned on the Eastern Front, draftsmen in white coats traced the outlines of sleek wings and slender fuselages. In labs from Peenemünde to Augsburg, engineers were designing for a time beyond Hitler, picturing a world where physics, not ideology, decided who ruled. At the center of it all stood Wernher von Braun, a man in his early 30s who already thought like his century hadn't started yet. His dream wasn't Germany's victory, it was space. He talked about passenger rockets orbiting Earth, even as his V-2 missiles flattened London. To his peers, he was equal parts visionary and opportunist. One of his team later said, "He aimed for the stars, but hit London on the way." Von Braun's genius was undeniable. He understood that the technology of destruction today would become the technology of exploration tomorrow. Inside his mind, the line between weapon and wonder barely existed. Nearby at Göttingen, another visionary, Hans von Ohain, was perfecting the jet turbine. While Allied aircraft still relied on propeller engines, his designs used pure compressed air. He wasn't a soldier, he rarely even wore uniform, but his laboratory was guarded like a fortress. To him, speed itself was the new weapon. His early prototype engines, ES-3, Jumo 4, looked like dense metal coils, ugly, heavy, inefficient. But when they roared to life, the ground shook. Those screeching engines broke a barrier that centuries of flight had never touched. Then there was Helmut Grötrup, younger, quieter, a mathematician obsessed with guidance systems. In 1944, he was calculating rocket trajectories over Europe using logarithmic tables while cities collapsed around him. His job was to make missiles think, at least as much as machines could think back then. The irony wasn't lost on him. The Reich he served distrusted intellect, yet its survival rested on people exactly like him. By this stage of the war, the Nazi Empire was crumbling. Supplies were vanishing, fuel scarce, but funding for the Wunderwaffe program, the miracle weapons, kept flowing. Hitler's ministers promised technological salvation. They believed engineering could compensate for the loss of territory. But many of Germany's scientists had already moved beyond belief. Inside closed conference rooms, they talked not about defending Berlin, but about what would come after. They drafted proposals for jet bombers powered by ramjets, for atomic research reactors, for missiles that could cross oceans. These weren't desperate last-ditch plans. They were blueprints for a post-war world where whichever nation mastered this technology first would dominate every other. In Berlin's Ministry for Armaments, Albert Speer understood this implicitly. He called it the long game. As Speer negotiated with industrial chiefs, he quietly linked research groups together, forming clusters of expertise that could survive even if the Reich didn't. He once remarked that the Third Reich might lose the war but win the future. That sentence lingered. Somewhere under the ashes of ideology lay raw, transferable knowledge, fluid dynamics, metallurgy, combustion, science that didn't care who commanded it. That's what made it terrifying, because detached from politics, it could attach to anyone. And as defeat grew inevitable, whispers circulated within the labs, "Don't destroy your work. Someone will need it." Engineers smuggled blueprints out of bombed cities. Prototypes were buried in salt mines, crates labeled as agricultural equipment. These men weren't saving their country, they were saving their life's work. Von Braun and his rocket team spent the war's final months calculating trajectories for missiles they'd never launch. He knew the Soviets were advancing from the east and the Americans from the west. Somewhere in his notes, he scribbled both forces' expected positions, weighing which side to surrender to. His colleagues joked grimly about it. Who will offer us more fuel, vodka or Coca-Cola? That cynical humor hid the truth. They were already playing the next game. In the jet laboratories, von Ohain watched his designs being dismantled for evacuation, not because they'd lost value, but because they were too valuable to leave behind. Technicians loaded turbine prototypes onto trucks bound for Austria. When questioned later, he admitted he never expected Germany to mass-produce jet fighters. It was always the experiment, he said. The war was just the experiment's funding. By early 1945, the disconnect between ideology and innovation had become complete. Hitler demanded miracle weapons that would change the battlefield overnight. His scientists were building theories that would change the next century instead. Fast swept wings for supersonic stability, pressurized cockpits, guided rockets, and nuclear chain reaction experiments. The true output of Nazi research wasn't hardware, but the leap in technical understanding. Within the laboratories, talk of a 1,000-year Reich in science circulated. It wasn't loyalty, it was professional arrogance. The Reich might fall, but the discipline of German engineering would endure. One memo recovered from Munich later read, "This knowledge will persist beyond borders." It sounds almost prophetic now. Amid the chaos, a subtle shift took place. The researchers began positioning themselves not as losers seeking clemency, but as assets to be recovered. Letters were written to Allied officers hinting at cooperation. Secret intermediaries traveled toward the approaching lines with lists of names and specializations. "We can build for you what we built for him," one note read. For every man preparing to flee, there was another preparing to bargain. They were visionaries, but not saints. They had seen the cost of their inventions, the London craters, the death tolls. But what truly haunted them wasn't guilt, it was irrelevance. Across Europe's ruins, they saw a dawning reality. The next superpower would be the one that understood physics best. Whether it spoke English or Russian didn't matter as long as it kept building. And so, even before the surrender, the outlines of the next conflict were already forming. In their notebooks, you can trace it. The same graphite pencils drafting the V2's curved fuel tanks, now sketching design improvements for longer range, heavier payloads, reusable stages. It was as if they knew someone else would finish what they started. By the time the Allies crossed Germany's borders, these men had already turned their defeat into opportunity. Their laboratories were filled with prototypes that pointed straight into the Cold War's future. The jet age, the missile age, the nuclear age, they all had their roots here, in those silent rooms where ambition outlasted ideology. But even the most advanced designs meant nothing if someone else claimed them first. Because knowledge, once scattered, becomes a battlefield of its own. And Germany's greatest scientists were about to become the most valuable prisoners on Earth. The collapse and the scramble. Spring 1945. Germany was burning itself out, but somewhere underneath the chaos, a quieter kind of war was already starting. The roads were filling with refugees, shattered troops, and trucks carrying what looked like farm equipment. But inside, those crates weren't tools. They were blueprints, rocket components, and pieces of technology no one else on Earth possessed. The Reich's collapse had turned into a scavenger hunt for the future. When American and Soviet commanders pushed into German territory, their orders included a very specific clause: find the scientists, find the laboratories, and bring everything that looks remotely important. Tanks could wait. Data couldn't. The first Allied soldiers to reach Peenemünde, the cradle of the V2 rocket, saw not victory trophies, but potential weapons of the next century. Concrete test stands stretched into the fog. Steel-cased engines sat cold and silent, ready to be reawakened. For both sides, time became the enemy. The Americans advanced from the west, the Soviets closed in from the east, and every mile brought them closer to history's most valuable prize, a collection of minds and machines capable of rewriting global warfare. Intelligence teams began marking their own maps, not with troop positions, but with rumored research sites. In southern Germany, US Army officers stumbled across bunkers filled with turbine engines, swept wing mock-ups, and reels of experimental film showing aircraft flying faster than anything America had built. Across the Elbe, Soviet troops were doing the same, storming abandoned manufacturing halls, tearing apart vaults, loading boxcars bound for Moscow. It wasn't looting, it was appropriation of the future. The field term became targets of opportunity. Entire towns were placed under protection not because of their residents, but because of who might be hiding in them: metallurgists, aerodynamicists, guidance specialists. These were people who, just weeks earlier, designed weapons for Hitler's war machine. Now they were bargaining chips. One American officer remembered driving through Nordhausen, unaware he was passing over miles of tunnels that had housed the Mittelwerk factory, where V2s were assembled by forced labor. When engineers from von Braun's team approached Allied lines waving white flags, the story they told was simple. They could offer the West a head start on rocketry unmatched by any other power. In that instant, surrender turned into transaction. By May, the operation would have a name, Paperclip. Officially, it was a program to bring technical experts to the United States for debriefing. Unofficially, it was a recruitment drive for genius, no matter its moral cost. Dossiers were rewritten, SS memberships erased, photographs retouched. What mattered was not who these men had served, but what they could build next. Von Braun's group surrendered deliberately to the Americans, treating surrender like a business negotiation. Their briefcases weren't luggage, they were vaults. Inside, thousands of pages of propulsion equations, secret fuel ratios, aerodynamic data, and years of costly experimentation distilled into ink and paper. In one move, they sold the future in exchange for survival. The Americans knew the Soviets were just days behind them, combing through the same mountain valleys. In one captured mine, rival search teams literally crossed paths amid stacks of machinery. For a brief moment, World War II and the Cold War overlapped in the same stone tunnels. Further north, the British and Canadians searched laboratories outside Hamburg. They found prototypes for radar-guided missiles, underwater detection systems, and even theoretical research into nuclear chain reactions. Some of the documents were half-burned, as though the scientists couldn't decide whether to destroy their work or preserve it long enough to trade for survival. In territories under Soviet control, a different strategy unfolded. Commanders like Ivan Serov organized systematic raids to capture not just documents, but entire families of specialists. Train convoys waited at night. Doors were kicked in. Engineers were ordered to pack what they could carry. The event would later be known as Operation Osoaviakhim, a relocation on a scale large enough to populate entire research cities inside the USSR. Meanwhile, American intelligence teams created their own field units. The ALSO's mission, originally formed to investigate Nazi atomic research, expanded its targets to include any advanced technology. Agents moved with speed, interrogating factory owners, chemists, and anyone rumored to have worked on high-priority projects. It wasn't enough to find hardware. They needed the people who could replicate it. In Peenemün's ruins, Soviet engineers documented every remaining test stand, collecting fragments of launch equipment before the Americans could return. In Bavaria, US ordnance officers discovered stacks of components for liquid fuel engines beyond any existing Allied design. Each piece told the same story. Germany's defeat had merely scattered a century's worth of innovation. Whoever reassembled it would define the future. The race soon turned ruthless. Coded telegrams flew between Washington, London, and Moscow, each side claiming priority access to captured material. Allied cooperation faded fast. Every discovery was suddenly classified. Laboratories once shared during wartime collaboration were now locked behind secrecy oaths. To the soldiers on the ground, it looked confusing, an army advance mixed with scientific treasure hunting. But intelligence operatives understood exactly what was happening. The end of the war had become a drawbridge to an arms race no one had declared yet. German civilians watched as foreign trucks rolled out of their towns carrying crates labeled fragile. Inside were sonar devices, pressurized cockpit prototypes, and reels of test footage for experimental pulse jets. In one small factory near Vienna, American officers discovered early blueprints for control surfaces resembling those used decades later on supersonic aircraft. They photographed everything, packed it, and shipped it to Dayton, Ohio. 4 months later, the Soviet equivalent material appeared in newly founded research centers outside Moscow. Not every scientist was captured or courted kindly. Some fled into hiding. A few vanished completely, swallowed by post-war confusion. Rumors resurfaced later in both the East and the West, claims that missing specialists had been relocated under assumed names, continuing research in secret. Historical evidence suggests most of those rumors stemmed from the sheer scale of the operations themselves.